Hello, my beautiful ladies and gentlethems, coming to you from a live suburban audience, including Chewy, who's pitter-pattering on my wood floor, all the cars driving by, and the sounds from my open window, which may include some screaming children because we live near a primary school, or a preschool, I'm not sure. I can't tell anything anymore. My brain's beyond fried. And I think that makes a wonderful opportunity to talk about things that are sort of beyond the usual everyday experience. And by that, I mean death. Of course, trigger warning before we start this episode, we will be talking about all aspects of death, including the harder things to swallow, grief, suicide, etc., religion. You know the whole scope. So please take care of yourself and exit if you need to. But for those who are staying, let's get right into it. Hello ladies, and gentlethems. Welcome to Wait Let Me Think, a journal podcast where I get to open up, critically reflect, and shamelessly ramble as I do anyway. So I was planning on calling this episode, Let's Talk About Death, Baby. And I think it's so ironic and hilarious because it's just equally as taboo and this sort of abject thing in our society that's like weirdly both very much connected to the embodied, the physical, and sort of like the material aspects of our flesh suits that we have the privilege to wear every day. I just wanted to like make an exciting new podcast episode that goes sort of beyond, taking from my own experiences, although this will be anecdotal as literally everything on my channel is, so expect some personal stories. But what brought this idea about was that yesterday I was hanging out with my aunt. Shout out to Tante Shirley. I'm working with her on her brand House of Mirali, and I'm gonna link that down below if you guys are interested in interior design. But she was signing the papers for donating your body to science, or if your organs are eligible for organ donation. I'm not sure how that fully works, but essentially you can donate your body to the state in the Netherlands, and that's something that a lot of people I think are having to sign off on, otherwise you're automatically going to be accounted for approving the donation if you do not state that you would require otherwise or that you would prefer otherwise. But it was a dilemma for her of like, what do I want to do with my body, or what am I going to consent to once I die, once I'm no longer in this body, or I guess maybe that's more technical. Maybe once this flesh suit is no longer ours, what do we want to do with it? Is it ours to begin with? We spend our whole lives taking care of it and nurturing it, making sure that it's getting the best care that it can, or sometimes harming it. But it's ours, and that relationship is very much just sort of between me and me. And there's a lot of politics about this and how our body is not ours, especially politicized bodies, and how certain gazes and acts and violations are almost always attached to certain bodies, but that's a different discussion that I would love to have next time. Irregardless, it was really interesting to watch my aunt sort of ask around. She was like, well, what would you do? My sort of impulsive reaction was kind of like, I don't care. And I realized that sort of sounded a little bit crass, a little brash to some people, or at least to my aunt. She was like, really? And I was like, I mean, yeah. Once I die and once my subconsciousness or whatever, my soul leaves this awakened life, or just life in general, I don't have a preference towards what's going to happen to my meat sack. It's, what am I going to do? I can't claim over it. I mean, I guess I can haunt the state, the government, or whatever poor scientist that's going to have to open up my body, but it's just not mine anymore, It's kind of like the idea of, to me at least, sharing or thrifting. Okay, this is thrifting bodies. When you have an old jacket that is no longer useful to you, it doesn't fit you anymore, it just doesn't work, but somebody else can benefit from it. To me, it's like, well, why wouldn't I? But that's not the same for everybody. I think I have a very pragmatic relationship with my body. And for a lot of people, it's a very complicated thing, sort of like, where does my body start and where does my soul end? Are they two separate things, or are they completely one thing that interchanges? Is this a dynamic relationship? Are they both not at all entities and kind of just this floating thing that is both absurd and dissociated from reality? You know, who knows? Everybody's got their own philosophies and theories about what this waking life actually is and what our physical bodies are meant to do. And sort of as a synchronicity, when I went home, I looked on Instagram and I saw that Flex Mommy has her podcast, her semi-factual podcast. I'll link the episode down below, and she was talking about death and the industry of death. I believe there's a really good memoir for this industrialization of death, specifically in the US context. It's called, let me think. Oh man, this is gonna take a while. Give me a second. Smoke Gets in Your Eyes? When Smoke Gets in Your Eyes? Maybe that one. I'm not sure. I haven't read it. But apparently it's about, you know, how expensive everything is, how everything is clinically done. It's sort of a step-by-step thing towards taking care of dead bodies once they need to be taken care of, I guess. Buried, cremated, whatever else methods they have nowadays. Anyways, back to Flex's podcast. One of the first things that she asked was, what would your funeral look like? What would your ideal funeral look like? And she said she wanted a destination funeral. And that made me laugh so hard. And it made me think, you know, what would my funeral look like if religion and cultural traditions didn't dictate it? And funnily enough, my sister Gwen and I were talking about this just last night, right before we went to bed. And I said, you know what? I think I would like for everyone to dress up really nicely. I want it to be like an old Hollywood glam, which is so Leo of me. But I was like, this needs to be an occasion. You know what I mean? This is the party of parties. This is an exclusive VIP funeral, and I want it to be high buzz, but very, very, very intimate. Just the people that I trust and love and, I mean, essentially care about. But, you know, the people that were really in my life. Sort of like, people need to dress up as their ideal self. I think that would be amazing. Or, if their ideal self is super far removed from reality, I'm thinking some sort of costume party. I'm really feeling that. Or everybody goes as their zodiac signs, which is kind of hilarious to me. And then I'm thinking maybe not their sun signs, but their moon signs, because I think it reveals more about the delicious, disgusting inner parts of us. I think our inner demons are founded in the moon signs or the moon placement, so that would be really, really interesting. Gwenny said she wanted a Kahoot game. I haven't done a Kahoot game, but apparently it's like a quiz where you test people on like questions that you make yourself, and she kind of wants to make a Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader version, but for herself, and whoever wins gets the biggest portion of the will. Super smart, but also can go very dangerous, because what if the person that she doesn't want to give it to will get all the money? Anyways, that might be a fun exercise before we start. What would your funeral look like if religions did not dictate them? Would you have a party? Would it be super happy, super somber? Are you into the drama of it all? Do you want people to be like breaking down in tears and sobbing over your grave? Let me know. I would love to hear it. I think it's just so funny how we want to be remembered and celebrated or mourned. And it says a lot about our inner egos and what we look for from our closest relationships. I think that's a super fun reflection idea. Party game! Okay, so let's talk about my experience with death. I've been pretty privileged to not have had to mourn many people in my life. I've gone to many funerals. I think all of them, if not just one, were in Indonesia, and, you know, all of my family there and family friends that I have gone to the funerals of were Muslims. The first death I experienced, I think, was one of my great-grandparents in the Netherlands, but I was about 2 years old, so I don't remember any of that. the first conscious death experience that I had was when my grandmother from my father's side passed away. And I was 5 years old. And I remember me and my cousins and my sister Icha, who was raised by my grandmother, we sort of had this very abstract idea of death already. In Islamic funerals, you see the body wrapped up in all the cloth and the embalming, but you pray for the body as the body is sort of laid right in front of you in the living room. And I remember seeing the white cloth, and I remember going to the burial, but afterwards I remember sitting with my sister Ita, and we just sort of sat out looking at the sky and the stars, and for some reason we just had this understanding, like, okay, you know, she's up there. She's one with the stars. She's also still here. She's both gone and not at all. And I thought that was a really interesting look back into the memory, because at 5 years old, that's already such a profound understanding of death. And I think that death has been such a taboo topic, especially in the West, and it's this really difficult thing to talk about. When in reality, I think we grasp death at a very early age. I think we understand more than we give ourselves credit for, and I think we understand more than we maybe want to. And I think that part maybe scares the sort of societal subconscious. Oh, and it's starting to rain. Awesome. We're really getting the full experience. Think of it as ASMR. Death and rain. I'm sure there's symbolism in that somewhere. Okay, aside from all the funerals that I've attended, I've also always had a very pragmatic relationship with death, as I said. I think it comes from the fact that, you know, for as long as I have lived, my dad has pretty much been a pilot, and it's a pretty safe job. You know, the actual numbers and possibilities of him getting into a plane crash are pretty small, but it's definitely been something that we've always sort of looked at, like, he might not come home when he leaves. He's always been very literal about, like, okay, if I die, then you need to take care of your siblings, you need to take care of this, you need to take care of that, you know where everything is. And that definitely probably gave me a complex growing up as a kid. But at the same time, it gave me this sort of relationship with death that wasn't surrounded by fear. You know, obviously I was, like, scared to lose my parents or my siblings, but I wasn't scared of death itself, because I knew that there was going to be an after that came after it, and that there was an action plan that needed to be executed. But that allowed me the space to sort of think about death, not as an abject, taboo thing that's detached from my life, but in fact accepting that it's definitely gonna come, obviously, and I have to grapple with that. It was confusing and difficult and a little terrifying to grapple with that at such a young age. I had a lot of nightmares where people would just suddenly die or were dying, and I had this, like, sort of ongoing fear. I had a lot of really bad anxiety growing up, especially in my teen years, and that caused a lot of irrational and compulsive thoughts. And almost every time I would get into a car, I would think, I could get into an accident right now. I could die. I had that last night while I was in a car when my aunt drove me back from her house. I was like, I'm sitting on the passenger seat of the car. You see this a lot in movies, that, like, they're either going to hit the driver's side or the passenger seat side first. Almost every single time, I'd be like, oh, we could die right now. And for some reason, I always have that thought when I'm in a car, and less so when I'm in a plane. I think there is actually a statistic about how being in a car is one of, like, the most dangerous vehicles you could be in as a human. I do believe that the car crash to plane crash ratio is pretty heavy on the car crash side. But I never really knew how to deal with that when I was young. It would just give me this kind of, like, anxiety, and I would just try to shove it away and not think about it for too long. But that kind of changed once I read this book by Paul Kalaniti. The book is called When Breath Becomes Air, and Paul is this neurosurgeon, and it's a memoir of how he looks at his life and reflects back on his whole life, and a little bit on his parents and his grandparents after he got diagnosed with cancer. The book is huge, and it's a best-selling memoir, and I'm sure most of you have probably heard of it or have read it. But for those who haven't, it's a very beautiful look into dying, and not in a romanticized way, not in a stylized way, but in just a very matter of fact that this is life and there is beauty and tragedy in that, but pushing past the tragedy. I read this book in one sitting. It was a beachside read, and I cried at the end of it. I highly recommend it. It's very, very digestible, and I loved learning about neurosurgery and his background as, I believe, a second-generation immigrant or third, and how his dying was affecting his marriage with his wife. And him and his wife actually had a kid after he was diagnosed. So he got to see a few years of, I believe, his daughter's life before he died, and how this whole experience has its bittersweetness and beauty and its humanness, but also how can we make sort of dying productive? How can we push past the fear of dying, the fear of the unknown, and the fear of, leaving all these people behind, and find a way out of it, or find release, catharsis, and healing from it? Essentially, Paul decided, not to go on overdrive and be like, okay, I'm dying, I need to do as much as I can before I die, but he accepted that that was what was happening. And I think also interestingly, he looked at, the fact that we are all dying. Everyone is dying, but we don't live like that's the truth. We live like we have, infinite days and infinite hours, and a lot of us put our lives on hold and our passions and living essentially on hold because we have pushed death so far away from from our daily lives, when in fact we're dying every second. We're getting closer to death every second. And Paul kind of confronts this thing that we've done to death in our society and in our daily lives. The lesson that I took away from the book was that there are numbered days, and everyone knows this, and that should be the driving force to living a life that you want to live. I think when him and his wife were talking about having their first child, she was like, wouldn't that, make saying goodbye all the more harder? And then he said, and how beautiful would that be? I think there's a lot of weight to that statement, in that the fact that our lives are so short, the same way that, our lives are trivial in the grand scheme of things, that's the beauty in it. You matter so little, and you have such little time that you can literally do anything that you dream of. And I think that's the sort of lesson that I took away from it. For me, I wasn't afraid of dying. I was afraid of having wasted my life. I was afraid that once I am in the face of death, I cannot say that I was satisfied, that I had done everything I wanted to do. And after reading When Breath Becomes Air, I sort of realized, that's sort of the beauty of it, that you don't get to do everything you've ever wanted to do, but you also get to do the small things that might matter the most, saying I love you to the people that are important. Which are like cheesy, I know, but it's true. Like putting the artworks, your creativity out there into the world, making a difference in all of the communities that you are in as much as you can, doing the micro things that are a part of your everyday life and giving your best in that. And I think that brings up a really interesting question as well about, like, why do we immortalize people in an innocent glow when they die? It's always people's best attributes that they talk about when someone has passed away. And I believe that there is beauty in that, and I think there's irony in that humans choose to only see the good things when things are over. But at the same time, I think if it was my funeral, I would like my family and closest friends to be honest, I'd like them to be like, well, she was moody, and sometimes she could be really mean, but she was honest, and she always tried her best every day. And that doesn't mean that I did amazing things, that doesn't mean that I won amazing awards and became the leading researcher in my field or saved a million lives. It was just that I did as much as I could with the things that I had. And I think that was where my fear of death stemmed from. It was this fear that maybe I am not doing the most with what I have. Maybe I let my ego get in the way and stop me from producing the art that I want to put out into the world. Maybe I don't put enough boundaries around my relationships, and therefore I'm not honest enough to a lot of the people in my life, etc., etc. So reading that book was a great way to really confront my fear of death, because people just say that they're scared of death, but like, what part of it is really scary? What aspect of the dying? Is it the pain? Is it the mourning? Is it the leaving a community? Is it the community forgetting you, maybe? All these super interesting questions to reflect on. I think an interesting part of death is also looking at whether or not souls still stay. Because I think the idea of a soul, or someone's mental, emotional energy, consciousness, whatever, is so tied to people's religious and scientific beliefs, or spiritual beliefs and practices. And a lot of different people, that I've talked to who have lost someone in their lives range from sort of like looking at them as having already passed this world and only going to the graveyard and then visiting it as a sort of like honoring of that lost dear one. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people who talk to their dead relatives, their dead friends, a lot of people who, put up shrines, put up altars for these people. A lot of people who consider their dead relatives as ancestral guides in their practices. There's a lot of different ways of looking at or contacting the people who have already passed. And I find that super duper interesting to look at between cultures, because at least in Indonesia, with the family that I was raised, where everybody is Muslim, the process of a funeral goes super fast. Like, you need to bury the body as fast as possible. You have like all these steps in taking care of the body, and then you need to invite an imam from the mosque to say all the prayers that need to be said. Everybody is invited like the next day or that evening to the family's home, and everybody is sort of praying and actively grieving and saying goodbye and blessing the soul all at once in a few hours. It's such a tumultuous time. It's such a rocky few hours. It's almost like organizing a high stakes event, like a concert or a wedding. It's super fast, go, go, go. You kind of just wake up and you lose someone, and then suddenly you need to do all these things, and then as quick as possible you need to drive to the graveyard, to the burial site, and then you need to, quickly bury the body. Whereas in other religions, that could take way, way longer. Sometimes the body is kept for a few days, maybe a week, where everybody gets to say goodbye to the body. Sometimes certain illnesses make it so that you can say goodbye and you have the time to do that. It's not like losing someone overnight. In some traditions, you might mummify the body. That might take years until you bury or do a funeral tradition within the community. So I've always found the mourning period to be very interesting, because I think, obviously we have a lot of questions about where do we go after we die, but that has less to do with us than the mourning does, because that's what, the people who are left alive need to deal with. And I've always been really interested in the taboo ways people have died, especially when someone has committed suicide. And if that happens in a place like in a Javanese community, for example, where I come from, suicide is super duper taboo. Suicide is considered a sin in Islam. And there's a lot of negative connotations to suicide. And when someone has committed suicide, we see it as someone has committed this bad act, or this family has fostered this bad act. And we almost use it as a blaming tool rather than looking at mental health of society as a whole, looking at how we've created systems in place that prevent people, young and old, to find help, to talk to people, to reach out to people, to be honest, and to feel safe when they're opening up about depression, etc., etc. And especially in the Islamic tradition, when you need to pretty much invite the whole extended family to a funeral, or the funeral process where you're praying for the body and the family. The family and the sort of the closest ones to this person who has passed doesn't really get time alone. I think it comes from this need for a community, and I think that the tradition was created in a good way, in the idea that the family needs to be surrounded by their extended loved ones, their friends, the people who are closest to them. They need help with the mourning. It's supposed to serve as mental and emotional help, being surrounded by so many people that are important in your life. And yet, Indonesian culture, and at least Javanese culture, has made it so that talking about mental health and mourning and mental illness, all these things, just sadness in general, such a taboo thing that maybe being around people makes you feel the opposite of getting help. It makes you feel like you can't process it openly. It makes you feel like so many judging stares are on you. It might make you feel like instead of being able to open up to your community, you have to put up a front and act like you're okay in front of the community. So then when does the mourning happen? I think in my culture and the culture that I grew up in, a lot of the sadness and the mourning and sort of like the negative things that people don't like to talk about, the icky, sticky things that come with complex human emotions, happen behind closed doors. It's almost like you're not allowed to see it and you're not allowed to hear it or talk about it, which I find so interesting because, death is so natural. And I think alongside that, how people die, like illness, whether that be physical or mental, is also so common and so natural in our daily lives that it's interesting how we choose to dissociate or associate ourselves with certain parts of death, dying, and mourning. Now, as a little story, because I think it's fun to look at unorthodox sort of practices of dealing with death, I am a pretty spiritual person. I'm quite in touch, with energy, source, spirit, whatever you want to call it, the universe. And I get some pretty interesting dreams that I think are both heavy in messages and sometimes prophetic. Sometimes I get dreams that tell the future, and I have a very interesting relationship with life and death in the family. I've dreamt of 3 of my nephew and niece's births, or at least the fact that my cousins were going to become pregnant and have children. And I've also dreamt people's deaths. I have one particular story. I think I was about 17 at the time, and this was at a time where I was sort of, starting to get used to the idea that maybe there is something beyond this sort of scientific and, Western sort of black and white life. And I had a dream about my great aunt, who at the time was already ill. And in my dream, I don't see people dying. And in my dream, she came to me at this wedding. And weddings are huge in the Javanese culture. They're a place where you meet everybody, and it's this huge thing of celebration, of coming together, of a lot of food, a lot of music, and a lot of culture. And we were at a wedding, and my great aunt came to me with my grandfather. So she was my grandpa's sister. And she was like, how come you haven't visited me lately? You know, she was always very, very kind to me, and we always had this sort of connection. She spoke mostly in Javanese, but she would always talk about stories of remembering me when I was a baby, whenever I would sit at her dinner table. My father lived with the family for quite some time in his youth, so there's a pretty deep connection to that side of the family. And so I had that dream, and I didn't really know what it meant. At the time, I was not fully practicing my spirituality, and I was still trying to decipher all of the different dreams and the meanings that I might have. So I kind of woke up and I told my parents, because we're always sharing different dream stories once we wake up in the household. And I was like, yeah, I dreamt about her, and she told me, you know, she asked me why we hadn't visited her recently. And my dad was sort of like, okay, we gotta go. We gotta go visit her today. And lo and behold, she passed away that very afternoon, I believe, or that night. I think she passed away the night of. And it was super interesting because we planned that day. Like, I woke up in the morning, and then by noon we had already left to go to their house to sort of just say, you know, we're here, and like I got your call from my dream. And then I think she was brought to the hospital that night, and then she passed away at the hospital. And it was really interesting because she's my great aunt. You know, I know her just as a relative. I am not her daughter, I am not her granddaughter directly. And I sort of had to tell this other family that, you know, I had a dream about your mother, and she came to me to sort of say goodbye. I felt like the harbinger of death a little bit, and it was a really, really bizarre experience to look at it from the outside and simultaneously be inside and not know, you know, the intimate parts of her relationship with the rest of her family, but also to have that extra information that nobody else did. It was just super weird, you know. And like I said, Muslim funerals happen very quickly. It was sort of like the whole night, so we stayed at the house because they had to prepare for the funeral. Her children, who are my aunts and uncle, they were pretty much just busy, like, trying to make sure that they had the foods. You know, the maids were cleaning up the house. They had to contact the local mosque, and, you know, they were preparing things for prayers. They were inviting people, notifying people, because it was nighttime, so people were going to come in the morning. That night, I barely slept. We stayed over there the whole night, helping everything come together. I fell asleep on the couch for a few hours. It was hectic, and also interesting to see that, you know, someone has passed away, and instead of going, okay, let's cry about this, let's think about this, let's sit in this, custom tells you, we have to move now. We gotta move fast, pronto, ASAP. Like, this and this and this and this needs to be done. These and these and these people need to be contacted. We need to order this. We need to order that. We need to contact the graveyard, make sure they're ready for the body. So much is happening. And it really made me confront a lot of the questions or questionable feelings I had about death and my relationship with it, because that was sort of the first time I was really hands-on and fully aware in a funeral. And I had sort of a part in it, even though, you know, it wasn't my direct family, but it was still family, and I had that dream. And I think ever since then, that also really made me look at death in a very sobered way, in a very practical manner, and also just made me realize that we're all intertwined. Like, our souls, if we have made that soul connection, or if we were meant to have that soul connection, our souls are intertwined. And I don't think that my great aunt has ever left me ever since I've realized that we had that connection. I don't think that my grandmother, who passed away when I was 5 years old, has ever left me. And I've recently received a few of her jewelry pieces from my aunt, and every time I wear them, it's always like I feel their energy. And whether it's soul or a ghost or a spirit, however you want to see it, for me, it's just I feel this vibrational tie. We're still connected to each other, and very strongly so. I've had friends who tell me that they use candles to feel someone's spirit there, that they sometimes just talk to the air in their room, or they'll go to a secluded nature place. Yep, that's the word. Place in nature. And they just start talking, and they know and they feel it in their heart that someone who is important to them, or whoever they're talking to, is listening to them. I find that so beautiful and so irrevocably human, this way of coping, this way of healing, this way of being forever connected to the earth, the ground, the souls that we touch and come into contact with, or have the privilege to know. Beautiful, huh? Okay, wow, I did not think I would end at such a nice spiritual note, but here we are. Here we are, folks. I think that's about all of the questions that I wanted to raise today. This episode is definitely less of a me, my opinion thing, and more of like a let's think through this. And I really enjoyed it. I hope you did as well. And if you'd like to answer any of the questions I raised, if you want to just talk about some thoughts you've been having about death or mourning or dying, etc., or life in general, I would love to hear it. I would love to continue this discussion, because I think that death is super interesting from all perspectives around the world, because it's so different for every culture and every person, and every family. So that is all that I have for you today. I hope that you have a wonderful, beautiful, magical day. I sound like a Disney princess. I hope that you have an amazing day wherever you are, genuinely. And thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you in the next one. Goodbye.